In the dusty frontier town of Cedar Junction, Kansas, where the scars of Civil War still bled fresh, and the railroad brought both opportunity and conflict, a love story would unfold that challenged everything a divided nation believed about race, honor, and the meaning of freedom. What began as a chance encounter between a decorated Buffalo soldier and a German immigrant seamstress would ignite a firestorm of hatred that threatened to tear apart not just two hearts, but an entire community struggling to define what America could become in the aftermath of its bloodiest chapter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden platform of Cedar Junction's modest train station as Sergeant First Class Marcus Washington stepped down from the westbound locomotive, his cavalry boots hitting the sun-baked planks with the measured cadence of a man who had learned to carry himself with dignity in a world determined to deny it to him. The blue wool of his 10th Cavalry Regiment uniform bore the dust of 1,000 miles, but the brass buttons gleamed with the same pride that had carried him through 4 years of frontier service, fighting Apache raiders and protecting the very settlers who would cross the street to avoid meeting his eyes. Marcus was 28 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or handle a Springfield rifle with equal skill. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who had spent years under the unforgiving sun of the American West, but his dark eyes held an intelligence and determination that had elevated him from escaped slave to decorated non-commissioned officer. In one of the most respected military units on the frontier, the 10th Cavalry, known to the native tribes as Buffalo Soldiers out of respect for their fighting prowess, had been Marcus's family, his school, and his salvation for the better part of a decade. He had enlisted in 1867, barely 3 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had declared him legally free, and the Army had given him something that civilian life never could: the chance to prove his worth through action rather than explanation. Now, with his 4-year enlistment complete and his discharge papers folded carefully in his breast pocket alongside his savings of nearly $300, Marcus had come to Cedar Junction with a dream that seemed impossible to many men of his circumstances. He intended to buy land, build a ranch, and create the kind of life that had been denied to his parents and grandparents who had lived and died in bondage. Cedar Junction itself was a product of the new America emerging from the ashes of Civil War. Founded just 5 years earlier when the Kansas Pacific Railroad pushed its iron rails across the prairie, the town served as a supply point for cattle drives heading north from Texas and a gateway for homesteaders seeking their fortunes on the vast grasslands that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It was a place where fortunes could be made or lost in a single season, where a man's past mattered less than his ability to work hard and shoot straight. The town's main street was a collection of false-fronted buildings that projected prosperity while concealing the rough-hewn reality of frontier life. Henderson's General Store occupied the prime corner lot, its wide windows displaying everything from farming tools to fancy dress goods imported from back east. The Cattleman's Rest Hotel and Saloon dominated the opposite corner, its batwing. Doors never still as cowboys, merchants, and travelers moved in and out of its smoky interior. Between them stretched a row of businesses that served the practical needs of a growing community: a blacksmith shop, a barber shop, a newspaper office, and the modest storefront that housed Greta Hoffman's dress shop. Marcus had learned about Cedar Junction from Captain William Hayes, his commanding officer, who had spoken highly of the opportunities available to soldiers willing to settle in Kansas. The Homestead Act offered 160 acres of government land to any man who could prove 5 years of continuous residence and cultivation, and military service counted toward that requirement. More importantly, Kansas had entered the Union as a free state, and while prejudice certainly existed, The law at least recognized his right to own property and conduct business. As Marcus walked down Main Street, carrying his worn leather traveling bag and leading his cavalry horse, Thunder, he drew the curious stares that any stranger might expect in a small town. But there was something more in those glances, a mixture of surprise, suspicion, and calculation that spoke to the complex racial dynamics of post-war America. Some of the stares were openly hostile, particularly from a group of men lounging outside the saloon who wore the slouched hats and casual arrogance of Confederate veterans who had drifted west after the war's end. The leader of this group was a man named Jeremiah Cole, though he bore no relation to the Ezra Cole from our previous tale. Jeremiah was a lean, angular man in his early 30s, with pale blue eyes and a carefully maintained mustache that gave him an air of genteel authority. He had served as a captain in the 3rd Texas Infantry and carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. His followers included brothers Samuel and Daniel Mitchell, former sergeants who had followed their captain west rather than return to a defeated homeland, and a handful of other ex-Confederate soldiers who found purpose in maintaining the racial hierarchies that the war had officially ended. "Well, I'll be damned," Jeremiah said quietly as Marcus passed, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. "Looks like one of those Buffalo soldiers has decided to settle down among civilized folks." Marcus heard the comment but didn't acknowledge it. He had learned during his military service that responding to every provocation only led to escalating conflicts that served no useful purpose. Instead, he continued down the street toward his intended destination, the land office, where he would begin the process of claiming his homestead. The land office occupied a small building next to the bank, its single room dominated by a large map of the surrounding territory marked with colored pins indicating claimed and available sections. Behind a scarred wooden desk sat Edgar Thompson, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the pale complexion of someone who spent his days with paperwork rather than outdoor labor. Thompson looked up as Marcus entered, his expression shifting from routine courtesy to obvious surprise. "Can I help you with something?" Thompson asked, his tone suggesting that he doubted Marcus had legitimate business in his office. "I'd like to file a homestead claim," Marcus replied evenly, setting his discharge papers on the desk. "I'm recently discharged from the 10th Cavalry, and I understand that military service counts toward the residency requirement." Thompson examined the papers with obvious reluctance, his lips pursing as he read the details of Marcus's service record. The documents were official and properly notarized, leaving no room for bureaucratic denial, but Thompson clearly wished he could find some excuse to refuse the application. "You understand that homesteading isn't just about filing papers," Thompson said finally. "It requires 5 years of continuous residence and cultivation. That means building a house, clearing land, planting crops, and proving that you're making productive use of the claim. Most folks around here aren't exactly ... welcoming to outsiders who might not fit in with the community." The warning was clear, though diplomatically phrased. Marcus would face not just the normal challenges of frontier farming, but active hostility from neighbors who viewed his presence as a threat to the racial order they preferred to maintain. "I understand the requirements," Marcus replied calmly, "and I'm prepared to meet them." The process of reviewing available land sections took the better part of an hour. Thompson seemed determined to discourage Marcus by showing him only the most marginal claims, sections with poor soil, inadequate water, or proximity to known trouble spots. But Marcus had learned to read terrain during his cavalry service, and he recognized that Thompson was deliberately steering him away from the better properties. "What about this section here?" Marcus asked, pointing to a claim along Willow Creek. "That offered both good water and fertile bottomland. It shows as available on your map." Thompson's face tightened. "That particular section, well, there's been some local interest. Folks who've been waiting for the right time to file their claims. It wouldn't be appropriate to jump ahead of longtime residents who have prior understanding about certain properties. The corruption was subtle but unmistakable. Thompson was reserving the best land for white settlers while trying to force Marcus to accept inferior claims that would make successful farming nearly impossible. It was a bureaucratic form of the same racial exclusion that Marcus had faced throughout his life, dressed up in the language of procedure and community courtesy. "I don't see any filed claims or pending applications," Marcus observed, studying the map more carefully. "And federal homestead law doesn't recognize prior understanding as a valid basis for reservation. Are you refusing to process my application for this section?" The direct challenge forced Thompson into a corner. Refusing to process a legitimate homestead application could result in federal intervention, particularly when the applicant was a discharged veteran with proper documentation. After several minutes of uncomfortable silence, Thompson began preparing the necessary paperwork, his resentment obvious in every scratched pen stroke. "You'll need to establish residence within 6 months and begin cultivation within 2 years," Thompson said as he completed the filing. "Failure to meet any requirement will result in forfeiture of the claim." Marcus paid the required filing fee and accepted his copies of the homestead documents. As he left the land office, he was acutely aware that filing the claim was only the first step in what would likely be a long and difficult process. He would need building materials, farming equipment, seed, and livestock, all of which would have to be purchased from local merchants, who might be reluctant to do business with him. His first stop was Henderson's General Store, a substantial building that served as the commercial heart of Cedar Junction. The interior was crowded with merchandise ranging from basic necessities to luxury items imported from eastern cities. Barrels of flour and sugar lined one wall, while bolts of fabric and ready-made clothing occupied another. Farm tools, hardware, and household goods filled the remaining space in an organized chaos that spoke to the diverse needs of frontier life. The proprietor, Benjamin Henderson, was a stout man in his 50s who had built his business by serving anyone willing to pay cash for his goods. He looked up from his ledger as Marcus entered, his expression cautious but not openly hostile. "Afternoon," Henderson said carefully. "What can I do for you?" "I need supplies for setting up a homestead," Marcus replied, producing a handwritten list he had prepared during the train journey. Building materials, tools, basic household goods. Henderson examined the list, his eyebrows rising as he calculated the total cost. The items Marcus had requested would amount to a substantial purchase, the kind that could significantly impact a merchant's monthly profits. "This is quite a order," Henderson observed. "You planning to pay cash?" Marcus nodded and pulled out a leather pouch containing his military savings. The sight of actual money seemed to ease Henderson's reservations considerably. Frontier merchants had learned that cash customers deserved respect regardless of their color, particularly when they were spending the kind of money that Marcus represented. "I can have most of this ready by tomorrow morning," Henderson said, his manner becoming noticeably more cooperative. "The lumber and hardware will need to be ordered from the railroad depot, but everything else is in stock." As Henderson began gathering the requested items, the door chimes announced another customer. Marcus turned to see a young woman entering the store, and for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. She was perhaps 25 years old, with golden hair pinned back in a practical style and blue eyes that reflected both intelligence and determination. Her dress was simple but well made, marking her as someone who understood fashion without being enslaved by it. "Good afternoon, Mr. Henderson," she said in accented English that immediately identified her as European-born. "I need thread for the Matthews wedding dress, and Mrs. Patterson is asking about the silk fabric she ordered." "Afternoon, Miss Hoffman," Henderson replied warmly. "The silk came in on yesterday's train. Thread's right over here." Greta Hoffman was 26 years old, though the hardships of immigration and frontier life had given her a maturity beyond her years. She had arrived in Cedar Junction 18 months earlier, carrying little more than her sewing skills and a determination to build an independent life in America. Her dress shop had quickly become essential to the town's social life, providing everything from work clothes to wedding gowns for the growing community. As she moved through the store gathering her supplies, Greta became aware of the tall black man in the blue cavalry uniform who was conducting business with Henderson. She had heard about the Buffalo Soldiers from customers who had relatives in the army, and she knew they were considered elite fighters who had earned the respect of both their officers and their enemies. But this was the first time she had actually seen one of these legendary soldiers, and she found herself curious about what had brought him to Cedar Junction. Marcus, meanwhile, was trying to concentrate on his business with Henderson while remaining acutely aware of the young woman's presence. In his years of military service, he had rarely had the opportunity for normal social interaction with women, particularly white women. The strict racial boundaries of frontier society made such contact both dangerous and unlikely. Their paths crossed at the fabric counter where Henderson was displaying the silk that Greta had come to collect. As she reached for the bolt of material, Marcus instinctively stepped aside to give her room, a gesture of courtesy that was both automatic and potentially problematic in a society that viewed such interactions with suspicion. "Thank you," Greta said simply, meeting his eyes with a directness that was unusual for the time and place. "Ma'am," Marcus replied with a respectful nod, his military bearing evident in the precise courtesy of his response. It was a brief exchange, lasting no more than a few seconds, but it carried a significance that neither of them fully understood at the moment. In those few words and glances, they had recognized something in each other, a shared sense of being outsiders in a community that demanded conformity, of carrying dreams that seemed impossible to achieve in a world designed to limit their possibilities. Henderson, who had witnessed the exchange, felt a flicker of unease. He was a practical businessman who understood the importance of maintaining good relationships with all of his customers, but he also knew the social dynamics of Cedar Junction well enough to recognize potential trouble when he saw it. As Greta completed her purchases and left the store, Marcus found himself thinking about her accent and wondering about her story. What had brought a young German woman to a frontier town in Kansas? Did she have family here, or was she, like him, trying to build something new from nothing? The remainder of his business with Henderson proceeded smoothly, with arrangements made for delivery of supplies to his homestead claim the following week. As Marcus prepared to leave, Henderson offered a piece of advice that carried both warning and wisdom. "Cedar Junction's a good town for folks willing to work hard and mind their own business," Henderson said carefully. "But it's also a place where people notice things, and they tend to have strong opinions about what's proper and what isn't. A man planning to make his home here would be wise to consider how his actions might affect his neighbor's comfort." The message was clear. Marcus was welcome as a customer, but his social interactions would be closely watched and judged. Any behavior that challenged racial boundaries would create problems not just for him, but potentially for anyone who associated with him. As Marcus left Henderson's store and walked back toward the hotel where he planned to spend the night before heading out to his claim, he was aware of the attention his presence was drawing. Word of his homestead filing had already begun to spread, and the reactions were mixed. Some townspeople seemed merely curious about the novelty of having a Buffalo Soldier as a neighbor. Others, particularly the group of Confederate veterans still lounging outside the saloon, radiated active hostility. "Uppity nigger thinks he can just waltz in here and claim land like he's white folks," Samuel Mitchell said loudly enough for Marcus to hear. "Someone ought to explain to him how things work in civilized country." Marcus continued walking without acknowledging the comment, but his hand unconsciously checked the position of the Colt revolver he wore on his hip. Military service had taught him to recognize the signs of potential violence, and the tension in the air around Jeremiah Cole's group was unmistakable. That evening, as Marcus sat in his hotel room planning the construction of his homestead cabin, he found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the brief encounter with Greta Hoffman. There had been something in her manner, a combination of independence and vulnerability that reminded him of his own situation. They were both outsiders trying to build new lives in a place that wasn't entirely welcoming, both carrying dreams that required courage to pursue. He told himself that such thoughts were dangerous and impractical. The social barriers between them were absolute, enforced by law, custom, and the threat of violence. Any attempt to bridge those barriers would likely destroy them both. But as he drifted off to sleep, Marcus couldn't shake the memory of her direct gaze and the way she had thanked him with simple dignity, treating him as a person rather than a category. In a world that constantly reminded him of his supposed inferiority, that moment of basic human respect had been both precious and unsettling. Neither Marcus nor Greta could have imagined that their brief encounter in Henderson's store was the beginning of a story that would challenge everything Cedar Junction believed about race, love, and the possibilities of freedom in post-war America. The battle for their right to choose their own destiny was about to begin, and it would test not just their courage, but the very soul of a community struggling to define what equality might mean in practice rather than principle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Marcus Washington rode out to his homestead claim, leading a pack mule loaded with basic supplies and the surveying tools he had borrowed from the land office. The 160 acres that would become his new home stretched along both sides of Willow Creek, a meandering waterway that provided the precious resource that could make or break any frontier farming operation. The land itself was a mixture of rich bottomland near the creek and rolling prairie that would require breaking for cultivation, exactly the kind of challenge that appealed to a man who had spent 4 years proving himself in the harsh conditions of the frontier cavalry. Marcus spent the first day walking every acre of his claim, noting the natural features that would determine where he built his cabin, corrals, and eventually his fields. The creek ran clear and steady, fed by springs that would provide reliable water even during the dry summer months. A grove of cottonwood trees near the creek's bend offered both shade and building material, while the higher ground beyond the Whale floodplain would be perfect for crops that needed good drainage. As he worked, Marcus was acutely aware that he was being watched. Riders appeared periodically on the horizon, observing his activities before disappearing back toward town. Some were merely curious neighbors wanting to see what the new homesteader was planning, but others carried the focused intensity of men conducting reconnaissance for purposes that had nothing to do with neighborly interest. The first real test came on his third day when Jeremiah Cole and the Mitchell brothers arrived at his campsite just as Marcus was preparing his evening meal. The 3 Confederate veterans rode with the casual confidence of men who were accustomed to intimidating others, their horses arranged in a semicircle that blocked Marcus's access to his rifle while keeping their own weapons easily accessible. "Evening, soldier," Jeremiah said, his tone carrying a mock courtesy that made his real intentions clear. "Thought we'd ride out and welcome you to the neighborhood. Make sure you understand the local customs and expectations." Marcus rose slowly from his position beside the campfire, his movements deliberate and controlled. Military training had taught him to recognize tactical situations, and this was clearly an attempt to establish dominance through the implicit threat of violence. "Appreciate the visit," Marcus replied evenly, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. "Always good to meet the neighbors." Samuel Mitchell, the older of the 2 brothers, leaned forward in his saddle with an ugly grin. "Thing is, we've been talking to folks in town, and there seems to be some confusion about your intentions out here. Some people got the idea you're planning to settle permanent-like, maybe even thinking about bringing in more of your kind." "My kind being what, exactly?" Marcus asked, though he knew perfectly well what Mitchell meant. "Don't play stupid with us, boy," Daniel Mitchell interjected, his younger features twisted with contempt. "You know damn well what we're talking about. This is white man's country, and we aim to keep it that way." Jeremiah held up a hand to silence his followers, his pale blue eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "What my associates are trying to say is that Cedar Junction has worked hard to maintain certain standards. We fought a war to preserve our way of life, and just because we lost doesn't mean we're going to stand by and watch everything we believe in get destroyed by folks who don't understand their proper place." The threat was clear, though carefully phrased to avoid any admission that could be used against them in a court of law. They were giving Marcus an opportunity to abandon his claim voluntarily, but the alternative was equally obvious. "One filed my claim legally," Marcus said. "Paid my fees, met all the requirements. I've got the same rights as any other American citizen." "Rights on paper and rights in practice are two different things," Jeremiah replied. "Papers don't stop accidents from happening. Creek could flood and wash out a cabin. Prairie fire could burn crops. Cattle could wander onto fields and trample everything. Lot of things can go wrong for a man trying to farm in country where he's not welcome." Marcus understood the message perfectly. If he insisted on staying, they would wage a campaign of sabotage and harassment designed to make his homestead impossible to maintain. The fact that they were being so open about their intentions suggested they felt confident in their ability to act with impunity. "I appreciate the warning," Marcus said carefully, "but I've dealt with hostile territory before. Comes with cavalry service." Jeremiah's expression hardened at the reminder of Marcus's military background. The Buffalo Soldiers had gained a reputation for toughness and competence that even Confederate veterans couldn't entirely dismiss, and the knowledge that Marcus was trained in warfare rather than just farming complicated their intimidation strategy. "Cavalry service is one thing," Jeremiah said, "but this isn't about fighting Indians or Mexican bandits. This is about understanding your place in a civilized community. And that place isn't on land that rightfully belongs to white folks." The standoff continued for several more minutes, each side taking the measure of the other without committing to immediate violence. Finally, Jeremiah gathered his reins and prepared to leave, but not without a final warning. "Think about what we've discussed, soldier. Cedar Junction's a small town, and news travels fast. Anything that upsets the natural order of things tends to create problems for everyone involved. Wouldn't want to see innocent folks get hurt because someone was too stubborn to accept good advice." After they rode away, Marcus spent a long time staring into his campfire and considering his options. He could abandon his claim and try to find land elsewhere, but running would only confirm their belief that threats and intimidation were effective tools for maintaining racial boundaries. Alternatively, he could stay and fight, but that would require him to be constantly vigilant against sabotage, harassment, and potentially lethal violence. In the end, the decision came down to the same principle that had guided him throughout his military service. Some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. He had not survived 4 years of frontier warfare only to be driven away by men who hid their cowardice behind threats and mob violence. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Father Patrick O'Malley, the Irish Catholic priest who served Cedar Junction's small but growing immigrant population. Father O'Malley was a man in his 40s with graying hair and the kind of weathered features that spoke to years of outdoor work before his calling to the priesthood. He rode up to Marcus's campsite on an elderly mule, his black cassock dusty from the trail. "Good morning, son," Father O'Malley said as he dismounted. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I make it a practice to visit new residents and welcome them to our community." Marcus was surprised by the priest's presence, but also cautiously grateful. In his experience, religious figures could be either allies or enemies, depending on their interpretation of Christian charity and racial hierarchy. "Morning, Father," Marcus replied. "Don't mind the company. Coffee's still hot if you'd care for some." Father O'Malley accepted the offer gratefully, settling himself on a log that Marcus had positioned near the fire. For a few minutes, they drank their coffee in comfortable silence, each man taking the measure of the other. "I understand you've had some visitors," Father O'Malley said eventually. "Men who perhaps didn't make you feel entirely welcome." Marcus considered his response carefully. Complaining about intimidation might make him appear weak, but denying it would ignore a reality that was obvious to anyone paying attention. "Some folks seem to have strong opinions about who should and shouldn't be homesteading in this area," Marcus said diplomatically. Father O'Malley nodded grimly. "Jeremiah Cole and his followers have been a source of trouble since they arrived in Cedar Junction. They seem to believe that losing the war gives them license to continue fighting it through other means." The priest's condemnation of the Confederate veterans was both surprising and encouraging. Marcus had expected religious figures to either ignore racial conflicts or actively support the maintenance of traditional hierarchies. "They made their position pretty clear," Marcus admitted. "Don't think they're planning to just accept my presence and move on." "No, I suspect they're not," Father O'Malley agreed. "But they're not the only voices in this community. There are people here who believe in the principles this country was founded on, including the idea that all men are created equal." The priest reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a small wooden cross carved from dark walnut. "I wanted to give you this," he said, offering it to Marcus. "Not trying to convert you or anything like that. Just thought you might appreciate knowing that someone in town is praying for your success." Marcus accepted the cross, moved by the gesture despite his uncertainty about organized religion. His parents had been devout Christians, but their faith had been tested by the realities of slavery and the apparent indifference of white churches to their suffering. "I appreciate the thought, Father," Marcus said. "And I'm grateful to know there are folks willing to judge a man by his character rather than his color." Father O'Malley stood to leave, but paused to offer one final piece of advice. "Be careful, son. Jeremiah and his men are dangerous, but they're not stupid. They'll try to provoke you into doing something that gives them an excuse to claim self-defense. Don't give them that satisfaction." After the priest left, Marcus spent the rest of the day beginning construction of his cabin. He had chosen a site on a slight rise about 100 yards from the creek, close enough for easy access to water, but high enough to avoid flooding during spring runoff. The foundation would be stone gathered from the creek bed, with walls of cottonwood logs that he would cut and prepare himself. The work was physically demanding, but deeply satisfying. Each log he felled and shaped represented progress toward a goal that had seemed impossible during his childhood in slavery. The cabin would be modest by Eastern standards, a single room with a stone fireplace and a small loft for storage. But it would be his own, built with his own hands on land that belonged to him by legal right. As he worked, Marcus found his thoughts returning repeatedly to his brief encounter with Greta Hoffman in Henderson's store. He told himself that such thinking was both dangerous and pointless, but he couldn't shake the memory of her direct gaze and simple courtesy. In a world where most white people either ignored him entirely or treated him with open hostility, her basic human decency had been a rare gift. Meanwhile in town, Greta Hoffman was dealing with her own challenges as she struggled to build her dressmaking business in a community that was still deciding whether to accept her as a permanent resident. Her German accent and unfamiliar customs marked her as an outsider, though not to the same degree as Marcus. The difference was that her foreign birth was seen as exotic rather than threatening, and her skills as a seamstress made her valuable to women who had limited options for fashionable clothing on the frontier. Her shop occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on Main Street, with her living quarters above. The space was small but efficiently organized. with fabric displayed along one wall and a large cutting table dominating the center of the room. A sewing machine, one of the new Singer models that had arrived on the railroad, sat near the window where the light was best for detailed work. Greta had been working late on Mrs. Patterson's wedding dress when she heard raised voices from the street below. Looking out her window, she could see Jeremiah Cole and several other men engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion outside the saloon. Their words weren't clear, but their body language suggested anger and determination. Won't stand. For it double quote she caught from one voice. Him his place. From another double quotes. Before he gets any ideas. From a third. The conversation continued for several more minutes before the group dispersed, but the tension in their voices lingered in Greta's mind as she returned to her sewing. She had heard enough gossip from her customers to know that a black soldier had filed a homestead claim, and she suspected that he was the subject of the men's discussion. The next day brought an opportunity for Greta to learn more when Mrs. Henderson stopped by the shop to order a new dress for the church. Social. Rebecca Henderson was a plump, pleasant woman in her 50s who served as one of Cedar Junction's primary sources of community information. "Have you heard about our new neighbor?" Mrs. Henderson asked as Greta measured her for the dress. "That Buffalo soldier who filed a claim out on Willow Creek. I heard something about it," Greta replied carefully, not wanting to reveal too much interest. "Well, some folks aren't too happy about the situation," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Jeremiah Cole's been stirring up trouble, claiming it's not proper for Collards to be owning land in a white community. He's been trying to organize the men to do something about it." Greta focused on her measuring, but her mind was racing. The hostility she was hearing about reminded her of the ethnic tensions she had witnessed in Germany, where differences in religion, region, or social class could trigger violence between communities that had lived peacefully together for generations. "What does your husband think?" Greta asked, knowing that Benjamin Henderson's opinion would carry weight in the business community. "Benjamin says the man's money is as good as anyone else's, and he filed his claim legal and proper," Mrs. Henderson replied. "He doesn't see any reason to cause trouble over something that's already been decided by the land office." It was a pragmatic position that reflected the merchant's perspective on racial issues. Henderson wasn't necessarily committed to racial equality as a moral principle, but he recognized that driving away potential customers was bad for business. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, and Greta didn't get a chance to ask more questions. But she found herself thinking about the homesteader throughout the day, wondering what kind of man would have the courage to claim land in a community where he knew he wasn't welcome. That evening, as she walked to the general store to purchase supplies for dinner, Greta noticed unusual activity around the saloon. A larger group than normal was gathered outside, and their conversation had the intense, conspiratorial quality of men planning something they didn't want overheard. She recognized several faces from her brief time in Cedar Junction: Jeremiah Cole and the Mitchell brothers, of course, but also some men she had thought were respectable members of the community. As she passed the group, she caught fragments of their discussion that made her increasingly uneasy. Tomorrow night when he's alone. Make it look like an accident. Double quotes. Double quotes. Send a message to any others who might get ideas. The implications were clear and terrifying. They were planning violence against the homesteader, possibly lethal violence, and they felt confident enough in their support to discuss it openly on Main Street. Greta hurried into Henderson's store, her mind churning with conflicting emotions. She barely knew the Buffalo soldier, had spoken perhaps 3 words to him, but the thought of men plotting his murder in broad daylight filled her with revulsion. At the same time, she was a single woman in a frontier town where her own safety depended on not making enemies of powerful men. As she gathered her purchases, Greta found herself facing a moral choice that would define not just her character, but potentially her future in Cedar Junction. She could remain silent and safe, or she could find a way to warn a stranger that his life was in danger. The decision she made would set in motion a chain of events that would forever change both their lives. Outside the store, the conspirators continued their planning, unaware that their conversation had been overheard by someone who would soon prove that courage could be found in the most unexpected places. The battle for Marcus Washington's right to exist as a free man in a free country was about to begin in earnest, and the stakes would be higher than anyone could have imagined. The clock in Greta Hoffman's shop ticked past 9 in the evening. As she sat at her sewing machine, her hands trembling too badly to guide the delicate silk fabric through the mechanism, the wedding dress that lay before her represented hours of meticulous work, but she couldn't concentrate on the intricate beadwork that Mrs. Matthews had requested. Her mind kept returning to the fragments of conversation she had overheard outside the saloon, and the terrible certainty that men were planning murder while the rest of Cedar Junction slept peacefully in their beds. Greta had experienced violence before. As a child in Bavaria, she had witnessed the brutal suppression of the 1848 Democratic Uprising, when Prussian soldiers had shot protesters in the streets of Munich and dragged suspected revolutionaries from their homes in the middle of the night. Her own father, a schoolteacher who had advocated for constitutional monarchy, had spent 6 months in prison for his political activities. The family's decision to emigrate to America had been driven partly by economic opportunity, but mostly by the desire to escape a society where expressing the wrong opinions could result in imprisonment or death. Sitting in her small shop above Main Street, Greta found herself facing the same moral choice that had confronted her family during those dark days in Germany. She could remain silent and safe, protecting herself by ignoring the suffering of others, or she could act on the principles that had driven her family to seek freedom in America. The sound of horses moving through the darkness outside her window made her decision urgent. Looking down at the street, she could see shadowy figures gathering near the livery stable, their movements deliberate and coordinated. Even in the dim light from the gas lamps, she recognized the distinctive silhouette of Jeremiah Cole's lean frame and the broader shapes of the Mitchell brothers. They were preparing to ride out toward Willow Creek, and their purpose was clear from the weapons she could see glinting in the LAMPL. IGHT. Greta extinguished her lamp and moved away from the window, her heart hammering as she considered her options. Warning Marcus Washington would require her to ride out to his homestead alone, at night, through country that could be dangerous even during daylight hours. More importantly, it would mark her as an ally of the very man that Jeremiah's group was targeting, making her a potential victim of their violence. But the alternative was to allow a murder to take place when she had the power to prevent it. The thought of Marcus Washington dying because she had been too frightened to act was unbearable. Whatever else happened, she would not be able to live with the knowledge that her cowardice had cost a man his life. Moving quickly but quietly, Greta changed from her shop dress into the practical riding clothes she wore for trips to outlying farms where customers lived too far from town to visit her shop regularly. She gathered a few essential items, her small Derringer pistol, a water canteen, and a shawl that would protect her from the night chill, and made her way down the back stairs that led to the alley behind her building. The livery stable was owned by Patrick Murphy, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in Cedar Junction about the same time as Greta. Murphy was known for his discretion and his willingness to help fellow immigrants navigate the sometimes hostile environment of frontier society. More importantly, he was one of the few men in town who was not afraid of Jeremiah Cole's Confederate veterans. Greta found Murphy in the stable office, working by lamplight on the harness repairs that occupied his evenings. He looked up in surprise as she entered, immediately noting her riding clothes and the urgency in her manner. "Miss Hoffman," Murphy said, rising from his workbench. "Bit late for a social call, isn't it?" "I need to borrow a horse," Greta said without preamble. "It's urgent, and I can't explain why." Murphy studied her face for a long moment, his Irish features serious in the lamplight. Like many immigrants, he had developed an instinct for recognizing when someone was in genuine distress, and he could see that Greta was struggling with something far more serious than a business emergency. This wouldn't have anything to do with the gathering that's been forming around town tonight, would it? Murphy asked quietly. Lot of men with guns and hard faces been moving through the shadows. Greta felt a surge of relief at Murphy's perceptiveness. She wouldn't have to convince him that something dangerous was happening, only that she needed to act quickly to prevent it. Someone's life is in danger, she said simply. I have information that could save him, but I need to reach him before it's too late. Murphy nodded and moved toward the stalls where his horses were kept. The bay mare is gentle but fast, he said, leading out a compact brown horse with intelligent eyes. She knows the country roads well enough to keep you safe in the dark. As Murphy saddled the mare, he offered advice that reflected his understanding of the dangerous situation Greta was entering. Stick to the main road until you're well clear of town, then cut across country if you need to avoid being seen. And remember, Miss Hoffman, some secrets are worth keeping, even from friends. Greta understood his meaning. Whatever happened tonight, Murphy wouldn't reveal that he had provided her with transportation. It was the kind of loyalty that bound together immigrants and outcasts who understood that their survival often depended on protecting each other from the hostility of the broader community. The ride to Marcus Washington's homestead took nearly an hour through countryside that seemed both beautiful and menacing in the moonlight. Greta had ridden these roads before during her business trips, but never at night, and never with the knowledge that armed men might be moving through the same territory with deadly intentions. Every shadow could conceal a threat, every sound could signal the approach of Jeremiah's rider's dot as she neared Willow Creek. Greta could see the glow of a campfire in the distance, marking the location of Marcus's temporary camp while he built his cabin. The sight filled her with both relief and apprehension. Relief because it meant she had arrived in time to deliver her warning, but apprehension because approaching an armed man's camp at night was inherently dangerous, particularly when that man had every reason to be suspicious of unexpected visitors. She dismounted about 50 yards from the camp and called out in a voice that carried clearly through the night. "Air! Mr. Washington, I need to speak with you. It's urgent." The response was immediate and professional. The campfire was quickly extinguished, plunging the area into darkness, and Greta could hear the sound of someone moving through the brush with practiced stealth. Marcus's military training was evident in the way he responded to a potential threat, taking cover while assessing the situation. "Who's there?" Marcus's voice came from a position different from where the fire had been, indicating that he had moved immediately after extinguishing the light. "State your business." "My name is Greta Hoffman," she called back. "I have a dress shop in town. I need to warn you about something." There was a long pause before Marcus replied, and Greta could imagine him trying to decide whether her presence represented a genuine emergency or some kind of trap designed to lure him into the open. "Step into the moonlight where I can see you," Marcus said finally. "Keep your hands visible and move slowly." Greta did as instructed, walking carefully across the uneven ground until she stood in a patch of open space where the moonlight revealed her clearly. She could feel Marcus's eyes on her, assessing the threat she might represent, but she couldn't see him in the darkness beyond the firelight. "I'm alone," she said, "and I'm unarmed except for a small pistol that I carry for protection. I came here because I overheard men in town planning to attack you tonight." The bushes rustled, and Marcus emerged from concealment with his rifle held ready, but not directly threatening. In the moonlight, he appeared larger and more formidable than he had in Henderson's store, his military bearing evident in every movement. "What men?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral but urgent. "What kind of attack?" "Jeremiah Cole and his followers." Greta replied quickly. "I heard them talking outside the saloon. They're planning to make it look like an accident, but they mean to kill you." Marcus absorbed this information with the calm professionalism of a soldier receiving intelligence about enemy movements. He had been expecting some kind of retaliation for his refusal to abandon his claim, but he hadn't anticipated that they would move so quickly to lethal violence. "When?" he asked. "Tonight. They were gathering when I left town. I rode here as fast as I could, but they may not be far behind." Marcus glanced around his campsite, quickly calculating defensive positions and escape routes. The camp was situated in a slight depression near the creek, which provided some concealment, but also limited his options if he needed to withdraw quickly. "Why are you warning me?" Marcus asked, studying Greta's face in the moonlight. "You don't know me, and getting involved in this could put you in danger." It was a fair question, and one that Greta had been asking herself during the entire ride from town. The simple answer was that she couldn't stand by and watch a murder take place, but the deeper truth was more complex. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said finally. "I've seen what happens when good people stay silent while evil is done. I won't be part of that." Marcus heard something in her accented voice that spoke to experiences beyond the normal boundaries of frontier life. This wasn't just a woman motivated by abstract moral principles, but someone who had witnessed injustice firsthand and understood the cost of inaction. "You should go," Marcus said, his concern for her safety evident in his voice. "If they find you here, they'll assume you're working with me. That could make you a target too." Greta shook her head firmly. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone. Two people have a better chance than one, especially if they're not expecting resistance." "This isn't your fight," Marcus protested. "You've done enough by bringing the warning." "It became my fight the moment I decided to come here," Greta replied with a determination that surprised them both. "Besides, you're going to need someone to ride for help if things go badly." The sound of approaching horses ended their debate. Marcus quickly kicked dirt over the remnants of his campfire while motioning for Greta to take cover behind a fallen log near the creek bank. He positioned himself behind a boulder that provided protection while offering clear fields of fire toward the approaches to his camp. "However many there are, let them get close before you start shooting," Greta whispered as she checked her small derringer. "The muzzle flashes will give away our positions." Marcus looked at her with new respect. Her knowledge of tactics suggested that she had more experience with violence than her appearance indicated, and her calm demeanor under pressure marked her as someone who could be trusted in a dangerous situation. The riders approached slowly, clearly trying to locate Marcus's camp without revealing their own positions. Greta counted at least 6 horses, possibly more, meaning that they were significantly outnumbered. The attackers had the advantage of numbers and surprise, but Marcus and Greta had the benefit of prepared positions and advance warning. "Washington!" Jeremiah Cole's voice carried clearly through the night air. "We know you're out there. Come on out and we can discuss this like civilized men." Marcus remained silent, knowing that any response would reveal his position and potentially expose Greta to danger. The offer of negotiation was obviously false. Men who came armed at night weren't interested in peaceful discussion. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Samuel Mitchell called out. "We just want to talk about your plans for this property." The lies were almost insulting in their transparency. If they had wanted to talk, they would have come during daylight hours without weapons. The nighttime approach and superior numbers made their real intentions clear. A gunshot shattered the night silence, followed immediately by the whistle of a bullet passing close to Marcus's position. The attackers had abandoned any pretense of peaceful intentions and were now shooting blindly toward where they thought he might be concealed. Marcus returned fire with careful precision, his military training evident in the disciplined way he conserved ammunition while making each shot count. The muzzle flash from his rifle revealed his position, but he had already moved to a secondary position before the return fire arrived. Greta remained motionless behind her log, her derringer ready but holding fire until she could be certain of her target. In the confusion of a nighttime firefight, shooting indiscriminately would be more likely to hit Marcus than any of their attackers. The battle continued for nearly 20 minutes, with both sides maneuvering for advantage while exchanging sporadic gunfire. Marcus's military experience gave him a significant edge despite being outnumbered, and his disciplined fire was beginning to make the attackers more cautious about exposing themselves. The turning point came when Daniel Mitchell, apparently frustrated by their lack of progress, attempted a flanking maneuver that brought him within range of Greta's position. As he crept through the brush near the creek bank, focusing entirely on Marcus's last known position, he failed to notice the small figure crouched behind the fallen log dot when Mitchell was close enough to ensure accuracy. Greta rose slightly and fired her derringer. The small bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the creek with a cry of pain and surprise. The sound of Mitchell's fall alerted the other attackers to the presence of a second defender, fundamentally changing the tactical situation. Instead of surrounding a single man, they now faced opponents in prepared positions who could coordinate their fire and cover each other's movements. "There's someone else out there," Samuel Mitchell shouted, his voice tight with concern for his wounded brother. "They've got us in a crossfire." Jeremiah Cole's response was swift and practical. Rather than continue a battle that was no longer going in their favor, he ordered a withdrawal that would allow them to regroup and plan a different approach. "Pull back," Cole commanded. "This isn't over, Washington. We'll be back, and next time, we'll be ready for your tricks." The sound of retreating horses gradually faded into the distance, leaving Marcus and Greta alone beside Willow Creek with the knowledge that they had survived their first battle, but certainly not their last. The lines had been drawn, and the conflict that would determine Marcus Washington's right to exist as a free man in a free country had begun in earnest. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with shades of gold and rose, Marcus and Greta found themselves sitting beside the rebuilt campfire, sharing coffee and trying to process what had happened between them. They were no longer strangers who had exchanged brief pleasantries in a general store, but allies who had fought together against a common enemy. The bond forged in that moment of shared danger would prove stronger than all the social barriers that sought to keep them apart. The morning sun revealed the full extent of the previous night's violence as Marcus and Greta surveyed the area around Willow Creek. Bullet holes scarred the cottonwood trees, spent cartridge cases glinted in the grass, and dark stains on the creek bank marked where Daniel Mitchell had fallen wounded. Most telling of all were the deep hoofprints that showed how Jeremiah Cole's riders had circled the camp, looking for angles of attack that would have allowed them to overwhelm a single defender. "They'll be back," Marcus said as he gathered the scattered brass casings that might be reloaded if ammunition became scarce. "But next time they'll bring more men and better tactics." Greta nodded, though her attention was focused on a more immediate problem. "Right now we need to worry about explaining what happened here. Daniel Mitchell will need medical attention, and questions will be asked about how he came to be shot." It was a sobering reminder that their victory in the night battle had created new complications. Mitchell's wound would require treatment from Dr. Harrison, Cedar Junction's only physician, and the story of how he sustained that injury would inevitably spread throughout the community. Greta's involvement would become public knowledge, with consequences that neither of them could fully predict. "You should get back to town before you're missed," Marcus said, though his reluctance to see her leave was evident in his voice. "The longer you're away from your shop, the harder it will be to explain where you've been." Greta understood the practical wisdom of his suggestion, but she also recognized that returning to Cedar Junction would require her to face the consequences of her decision to warn Marcus. Her alliance with him was no longer secret, and she would have to navigate the social and economic repercussions of being marked as a supporter of the man that powerful interests wanted to destroy. "What will you do?" she asked as she prepared to mount Murphy's bay mare for the ride back to town. "Marcus, gestured toward the partially completed cabin that represented months of labor and planning. "Finish what I started. But I'll need to be more careful about security. Last night proved they're willing to use lethal force." As Greta rode away from the homestead, Marcus began implementing defensive measures that drew on his cavalry experience. He moved his camp to higher ground that offered better visibility and multiple escape routes. He cached supplies and ammunition in hidden locations throughout his property. Most importantly, he established a routine that varied his daily activities and sleeping locations, making it difficult for potential attackers to predict his movements. The ride back to Cedar Junction gave Greta time to consider how she would handle the inevitable questions about her nighttime absence. Her living quarters above the dress shop provided privacy, but several neighbors had windows that overlooked the alley where she had retrieved her horse. Someone had almost certainly noticed her departure, even if they hadn't understood its significance. At the time, she arrived in town just as the church bells were ringing for morning services, providing convenient cover for her return to Murphy's livery stable. The Irish stable owner took the reins of his bay mare without comment, but his knowing look confirmed that he understood the seriousness of whatever had occurred during her nighttime journey. "Everything work out the way you hoped?" Murphy asked, quietly as he led the mare back to her stall. "For now," Greta replied, though they both knew that the night's events had likely created more problems than they had solved. The first sign of trouble came when Greta entered her shop to find Mrs. Patterson waiting outside the front door with an expression of barely controlled anger. Sarah Patterson was the wife of Cedar Junction's bank president and one of the town's most influential social leaders. Her disapproval could effectively destroy any business that depended on community support. "Miss Hoffman," Mrs. Patterson said, with icy formality, "I think we need to have a conversation about certain recent events." Greta unlocked her shop door and gestured for Mrs. Patterson to enter, though she suspected that this conversation would not end with a dress order. The banker's wife had the kind of refined features and expensive clothing that marked her as someone accustomed to having her opinions treated as facts. "I understand there was some unpleasantness out on Willow Creek last night," Mrs. Patterson continued once they were inside the shop. "Gunfire, injuries, the kind of disturbance that reflects poorly on our entire community." Greta busied herself arranging fabric samples, trying to appear casual while her mind raced through possible responses. Denying knowledge of the events would be pointless if witnesses had seen her leaving town, but admitting involvement would confirm suspicions about her loyalties. "I hadn't heard about any trouble," Greta said carefully. "Is someone hurt?" Mrs. Patterson's smile was cold and knowing. "Daniel Mitchell is being treated by Dr. Harrison for a gunshot wound. He claims he was shot while investigating reports of trespassers on property that doesn't rightfully belong to the person currently occupying it." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the racial animosity behind Mrs. Patterson's words. In her version of events, Marcus was a trespasser rather than a legal homesteader, and the men who had attacked him were concerned citizens protecting community property. "That's unfortunate," Greta replied neutrally. "I hope Mr. Mitchell recovers quickly." "What's more unfortunate," Mrs. Patterson continued, "is that there are rumors suggesting that certain members of our community may have provided assistance to the trespasser. That kind of disloyalty to one's neighbors is deeply troubling." The threat was clear, though diplomatically phrased. Greta was being warned that her suspected involvement in the previous night's events had been noted by the town's power structure, and that continuing to support Marcus could result in social and economic retaliation. "I'm not sure what you mean," Greta said, though they both knew that her denial fooled no one. Mrs. Patterson moved toward the shop's front window, where wedding dresses and formal gowns displayed Greta's skill with expensive fabrics and intricate designs. The implication was obvious. All of this could be destroyed if Greta made the wrong choices about her future loyalties. "What I mean," Mrs. Patterson said, is that Cedar Junction is a small community where people depend on each other for prosperity and security. When someone acts in ways that threaten that harmony, it affects everyone's well-being. She paused to examine one of Greta's wedding dresses, her fingers tracing the delicate beadwork with apparent appreciation. "This is beautiful work. It would be a shame if circumstances forced you to close your shop and seek opportunities elsewhere." The message couldn't have been clearer. Continue supporting Marcus and face economic destruction through the withdrawal of community support. Abandon him and continue to prosper as a valued member of Cedar Junction society. After Mrs. Patterson left, Greta sat at her sewing machine and tried to process the full implications of her situation. She had known that warning Marcus would have consequences, but she hadn't fully considered how completely those consequences could destroy the new life she had built in America. Her dress shop represented 2 years of careful work and sacrifice. Losing it would mean starting over with nothing, possibly in a different town where her reputation hadn't been destroyed by association with the wrong causes. Meanwhile, across town, Dr. Harrison was dealing with his own version of the same moral dilemma as he treated Daniel Mitchell's gunshot wound. The young physician had taken an oath to heal all patients regardless of their circumstances, but he was also keenly aware that his practice depended on community support that could be withdrawn if he made unpopular decisions. Mitchell's wound was serious, but not life-threatening. The small caliber bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder without hitting bone or major blood vessels. But the circumstances of the injury raised troubling questions about what had really happened at Marcus Washington's homestead. "You're lucky," Dr. Harrison told Mitchell as he finished bandaging the wound. "Another inch to the right and that bullet would have hit your collarbone. Could have shattered it badly enough to cripple your arm permanently." Mitchell's face was pale from blood loss and pain, but his eyes burned with hatred and humiliation. Being wounded by what he assumed was Marcus Washington was bad enough, but discovering that his attacker had been a woman made the injury feel like a personal insult that demanded revenge. "That nigger had help," Mitchell said through gritted teeth. Someone was working with him. Someone who knew how to handle a gun. Dr. Harrison carefully avoided responding to Mitchell's speculation. As one of the few educated men in Cedar Junction, he was often drawn into political discussions that he preferred to avoid. His medical training had taught him to focus on facts rather than assumptions, and the facts of Mitchell's injury raised more questions than they answered. The bullet that Harrison had extracted was from a small caliber weapon, possibly a Derringer or pocket pistol. That suggested either extremely accurate shooting from a rifle at long range or close quarters combat with a concealed weapon. Either scenario contradicted the story that Jeremiah Cole's group was telling about investigating suspected trespassers. "Who do you think was helping him?" Dr. Harrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "That German woman," Mitchell replied with vicious certainty. "The one with the dress shop. Someone saw her leaving town last night on horseback. Timing's too convenient to be coincidence." Harrison felt a chill as he realized the implications of Mitchell's accusation. If Greta Hoffman had indeed warned Marcus about the planned attack, she had shown remarkable courage but also placed herself in extreme danger. The Confederate veterans would view her intervention as an act of war that demanded appropriate retaliation. "That's a serious accusation," Harrison said carefully. "You'd better be certain before you start spreading that story around town." Mitchell's smile was ugly with anticipation. "Oh, I'm certain. And when Jeremiah gets done with her, she wished she'd minded her own business like a proper woman should." The threat sent Harrison's mind racing through the ethical implications of his situation. He had a professional obligation to maintain patient confidentiality, but he also had a moral duty to prevent violence against innocent people. If Mitchell was planning retaliation against Greta, Harrison needed to find a way to warn her without violating his medical ethics. The solution came to him as he was cleaning his instruments after Mitchell left the office. Father O'Malley often visited the clinic to check on sick parishioners, and his presence wouldn't seem unusual to anyone watching the building. The priest could serve as an intermediary who would warn Greta about the danger she faced without directly involving Harrison in actions that could destroy his medical practice. Father O'Malley arrived at the clinic within an hour of Harrison's carefully worded message, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for visiting a bedridden parishioner. But once they were alone in Harrison's office, the priest's expression grew serious as he listened to the doctor's account of Mitchell's threats. "They're planning to retaliate against Miss Hoffman?" Father O'Malley asked, though he didn't seem surprised by the news. Mitchell seemed confident that she was involved in last night's events, Harrison replied. And he was equally confident that Jeremiah Cole would want to punish her for that involvement. Father O'Malley nodded grimly. He had been expecting something like this ever since hearing rumors about the gunfight at Marcus's homestead. Violence had a way of escalating beyond its original targets, drawing in anyone who showed sympathy for the wrong side. "I'll speak with her," the priest said. "She needs to understand the danger she's in." But even as Father O'Malley agreed to deliver the warning, both men knew that Greta's options were severely limited. She could flee Cedar Junction, abandoning everything she had worked to build, or she could stay and face whatever retaliation Jeremiah's group had planned. Neither choice offered safety, and both required a kind of courage that most people never had to summon. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Cedar Junction's main street, the lines of conflict were becoming clear. Marcus Washington's fight for his homestead had expanded into a broader struggle that would test the character of everyone in the community. Some, like Greta and Father O'Malley, had chosen to stand with justice despite the personal cost. Others, like Mrs. Patterson and the Confederate veterans, were determined to maintain racial hierarchies through intimidation and violence. The battle for Marcus's right to exist as a free man was no longer just about land ownership or legal rights. It had become a test of whether America's promises of equality and justice could survive the hatred of those who preferred the certainties of oppression to the challenges of true freedom. And in a small frontier town where everyone knew everyone else's business, that test would be decided not by abstract principles, but by the courage of individuals willing to risk everything for what they believed was right. Father O'Malley found Greta in her shop just as the afternoon sun began casting long shadows across Main Street. She was working on Mrs. Anderson's Sunday dress, her needle moving with mechanical precision, while her mind clearly wrestled with problems far more complex than hemlines and button placement. The priest's arrival through the back entrance, rather than the front door that customers normally used, immediately signaled that his visit involved more than casual conversation. "Miss Hoffman," Father O'Malley said quietly, glancing around the shop to ensure they were alone. "We need to talk about your safety." Greta set down her sewing and looked at the priest with eyes that already held the knowledge of impending trouble. "It's about last night, isn't it? They know I was there. Daniel Mitchell is telling anyone who listened that you shot him," Father O'Malley confirmed. "Jeremiah Cole is using that accusation to justify whatever retaliation he's planning. Doctor, Harrison thought you should know what you're facing." The confirmation of her worst fears brought an odd sense of relief to Greta. Uncertainty had been worse than knowing the truth, even when that truth promised danger and hardship. Now she could at least prepare for what was coming, instead of jumping at every shadow and unexpected sound. "What kind of retaliation?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The kind that's designed to drive you out of town," Father O'Malley replied grimly. "Economic pressure, social isolation, and if those don't work, probably direct violence. These men fought a war to preserve their way of life, and they're not going to let a seamstress and a Buffalo Soldier change their minds about racial hierarchy." Greta moved to her front window and looked out at the familiar street where she had built her new life in America. The view included Henderson's General Store, where she had first encountered Marcus Washington, and the saloon where Jeremiah Cole's group gathered to plan their campaigns of intimidation. It seemed impossible that such an ordinary place could become a battlefield over questions of justice and human dignity. "I could leave," she said, though the words felt like admitting defeat. "Pack my things and take the next train east." "Start over somewhere else." "You could," Father O'Malley agreed. "But would you be able to live with yourself, knowing that you ran when an innocent man needed your help?" It was the question that Greta had been asking herself ever since Mrs. Patterson's threatening visit. Abandoning Marcus now would save her business and possibly her life, but it would also confirm everything she had once despised about the people who stood by silently while injustice was committed in their names. What's the alternative? She asked. Stay here and watch them destroy everything I've worked for? Let them turn me into an example of what happens to people who don't know their place. Father O'Malley was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of personal experience with persecution and resistance. Sometimes we have to choose between our comfort and our conscience, between what's safe and what's right. Your family made that choice when they left Germany, didn't they? The priest's words struck at the heart of Greta's dilemma. Her parents had sacrificed security and prosperity in Bavaria to seek freedom in America, accepting the risks of immigration rather than living under political oppression. Now she faced a similar choice between safety and principle, and the example of her family's courage seemed to point toward only one possible decision. If I stay, what can I actually do to help him? Greta asked. I'm one woman with a dress shop and a small pistol. They have numbers, money, and the support of half the town. You have something they don't, Father O'Malley replied. You have the moral authority that comes from standing up for what's right. That kind of authority can inspire others who might be afraid to act alone. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the street. Outside, Jeremiah Cole and Samuel Mitchell were riding slowly down Main Street, their presence clearly intended to intimidate rather than accomplish any specific business. Behind them rode 4 other men, all armed and wearing the casual arrogance of people who believed they could act with impunity. They're making their power visible, Father O'Malley observed, reminding everyone in town who's really in charge here. Greta watched the riders with a mixture of fear and defiance that surprised her with its intensity. These men represented everything she had hoped to escape by coming to America: the arbitrary exercise of power, the crushing of individual will, the reduction of human beings to categories that determined their worth and their fate. I'm not leaving, she said suddenly, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. Whatever happens, I'm not going to run away and let them win. Father O'Malley smiled, though his expression remained concerned. That's a brave choice, but bravery without preparation is just a different kind of foolishness. If you're going to stay and fight, you need to be smart about it. The priest's advice proved prescient when Benjamin Henderson arrived at the shop an hour later with news that confirmed their worst fears about the economic pressure campaign. The merchant looked uncomfortable as he delivered a message that clearly went against his personal inclinations. Miss Hoffman, Henderson began hesitantly, I've been asked to inform you that several prominent families are reconsidering their arrangements with your shop. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Thompson, they're all canceling their orders and requesting refunds for work not yet completed. The financial blow was devastating. Those 3 women represented nearly half of Greta's regular customers, and their orders for the upcoming social season had provided the income she needed to maintain her shop through the winter months. Losing them would make it nearly impossible to continue operating her business. And I suppose these cancellations have nothing to do with recent events? Greta asked, though she knew the answer. Henderson's expression grew even more uncomfortable. There's been talk about loyalty to the community, about supporting businesses. that share our values. Some folks feel that certain recent actions have raised questions about where your loyalties lie. My loyalties lie with justice and human decency, Greta replied firmly. If that makes me unsuitable for their business, then perhaps they should find another seamstress. Henderson looked genuinely pained by the situation. As a practical businessman, he understood the value of Greta's skills and the foolishness of driving away talented workers over political disagreements. But he also recognized the economic realities of a small town where alienating powerful customers could destroy any business. "I'm sorry about this," Henderson said. "For what it's worth, I think you're getting a raw deal. But I also think you should consider whether this fight is worth losing everything you've built here." After Henderson left, Greta sat among the half-finished dresses and carefully ordered supplies that represented her livelihood, trying to calculate how long she could survive the economic boycott. Her savings would last perhaps 2 months if she was extremely careful, but that assumed no additional sources of income and no unexpected expenses. If Jeremir's group escalated to direct attacks on her property, even that modest timeline would prove optimistic. The sound of someone entering through her back door interrupted these grim calculations. Greta reached for her derringer before recognizing the familiar voice of Patrick Murphy calling out a greeting. The Irish stable owner entered her shop carrying a large bundle wrapped in canvas, his expression serious but not threatening. "Brought you something that might come in handy," Murphy said, setting the bundle on her cutting table. "Times like these, a person needs reliable friends and reliable equipment." Inside the canvas wrapping was a Winchester rifle, along with 2 boxes of ammunition and a leather gun belt designed to hold extra cartridges. The weapon was well maintained and obviously expensive, far more substantial than Greta's small derringer. "I can't afford this," Greta protested, though she recognized the practical necessity of better weapons if she intended to continue supporting Marcus. "It's not for sale," Murphy replied. "It's a loan between friends. When this trouble's over, you can give it back. Until then, make sure you know how to use it properly." The gesture of solidarity from Murphy was both encouraging and sobering. It suggested that she wasn't as alone as she had feared, but it also confirmed that the conflict was escalating toward open warfare between 2 factions of the community. "How many others are willing to stand up to Cole's group?" Greta asked. Murphy considered the question carefully. "Not as many as there should be, but more than you might think. Problem is, most folks are scared. They've got families to protect and businesses to worry about. Hard to blame them for keeping their heads down. But some will fight if it comes to that." "Some will," Murphy confirmed. "Dr. Harrison's got spine when it comes to doing what's right. Father O'Malley's not afraid of much. There's maybe 6 or 8 others who'll stand up when push comes to shove. Not enough to win a straight fight, but enough to make them think twice about what they're doing." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from the front of the shop. Murphy and Greta rushed to the main room to find that someone had thrown a rock through the large window that displayed her finest work. Attached to the rock was a note written in crude block letters: "Nigger lovers get out or get hurt." The message was clear and immediate. The economic pressure campaign had failed to drive Greta away quickly enough, so Jeremir's group was escalating to property destruction and direct threats. The broken window would cost money she couldn't afford to replace, and the public nature of the vandalism would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider supporting Marcus. "They're getting impatient," Murphy observed as he examined the damage. "That's good and bad. Good because it means they're worried about something. Bad because desperate people do stupid things that get innocent folks hurt." As they swept up the broken glass, Greta found herself thinking about Marcus Washington alone on his homestead, facing the same kind of escalating pressure with even fewer resources and allies. The thought of him standing against Jeremir's hatred, with nothing but his military training and determination, filled her with a mixture of admiration and concern that she was only beginning to understand. "I need to get word to him," she said suddenly. "Marcus needs to know that the pressure is increasing, that they're not going to be satisfied with driving us apart. They want both of us gone, and they're willing to use whatever force it takes." Murphy nodded grimly. "I'll ride out there tonight. But you need to understand something, Miss Hoffman. This isn't going to end with warnings and broken windows. Jeremiah Cole's group has gone too far to back down now, and your Mr. Washington doesn't strike me as the kind of man who runs from a fight. This is heading toward real violence, the kind that leaves people dead or broken." Greta looked at the Winchester rifle Murphy had brought her, its metal surfaces gleaming dully in the lamplight. She had never imagined that her search for freedom in America would require her to take up arms against fellow Americans, but the logic of events seemed to be pushing inexorably toward that conclusion. "Then we'd better be ready for it," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Because I'm not running, and I don't think Marcus Washington is either." As night fell over Cedar Junction, the broken window in Greta's shop served as a visible reminder that the conflict between justice and hatred had moved beyond words and economic pressure. The real battle was just beginning, and its outcome would determine not just the fate of two individuals, but the character of an entire community struggling to define what American freedom actually meant in practice at Patrick Murphy's nighttime. Ride to Marcus Washington's homestead carried more than just warnings about escalating violence. Hidden in his saddlebags was a carefully wrapped package that Greta had prepared during the long hours after her shop window was shattered. A package that would change everything between the Buffalo Soldier and the German seamstress who had risked her life to save his. Inside the canvas wrapping were practical items: ammunition for Marcus's rifle, medical supplies in case of future injuries, and dried provisions that could sustain him if he was forced to remain hidden for extended periods. But nestled among these necessities was something more personal, a letter written in Greta's careful script, along with a spare shirt she had sewn in the quiet hours before dawn, measuring it against the mental image she carried of Marcus's broad shoulders and military bearing. Marcus received Murphy's visit with the wariness of a soldier who had learned that unexpected visitors often brought unwelcome news. But as the Irish stable owner explained the situation in town, the economic boycott, the broken window, the escalating threats, Marcus found himself experiencing emotions that went far beyond gratitude for tactical intelligence. "She's putting herself in real danger to help me," Marcus said as he examined the contents of Greta's package. "More danger than she probably realizes." Murphy studied the younger man's face in the firelight, recognizing something beyond mere concern for an ally's safety. "Seems to me she realizes exactly what she's risking. Question is, do you understand what she's trying to tell you?" Marcus held up the shirt Greta had made, noting the precise stitching and careful attention to details that spoke of hours of patient work. No woman spent that kind of time and effort on clothing for a man unless her feelings ran deeper than simple friendship or political alliance. "I understand," Marcus said quietly. "But understanding and acting on it are two different things. A black man and a white woman, even if we both wanted something more, the world wouldn't let us have it." "The world's changing," Murphy replied. "Maybe slower than it should, but it's changing. Question is whether you're brave enough to be part of that change, or if you're going to let other people's hatred decide how you live your life." The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of riders moving through the darkness, beyond Marcus's defensive perimeter. Both men immediately took cover and prepared for another attack, but the horsemen passed without approaching the homestead directly. It was a reconnaissance patrol, gathering intelligence about Marcus's defenses and daily routines. "They're planning something big," Murphy observed as the hoofbeats faded into the distance. "More men than last time, probably better organized too." Marcus nodded grimly. His military experience had taught him to recognize the pattern of escalating warfare, and Everything pointed toward a major assault designed to finish what the previous attacks had failed to accomplish. "How many reliable allies do we have in town?" Marcus asked. "Maybe 8 or 10 who'll actually fight when it comes down to it," Murphy replied. "Father O'Malley, Dr. Harrison, myself, a few others. Not enough to win a pitched battle, but enough to make them pay a heavy price for whatever they're planning." The tactical situation was sobering but not hopeless. Marcus had faced worse odds during his cavalry service, and the advantage of fighting from prepared defensive positions partially offset the enemy's superior numbers. But the real challenge wouldn't be military. It would be protecting innocent people like Greta, who had become targets because of their association with him. "I need to see her," Marcus said suddenly, the decision crystallizing as he spoke. "If they're planning a major attack, she needs to know how to coordinate with our defensive preparations. And there are things that need to be said between us, regardless of what happens." Murphy understood the deeper meaning behind Marcus's tactical justification. "Risky move, riding into town when Cole's men are watching everything. But I reckon some risks are worth taking." The plan they developed was simple but effective. Murphy would return to town openly, following his normal route and timing to avoid suspicion. Marcus would wait until the early morning hours when most people were asleep, then approach Cedar Junction through the creek bed that provided concealment until he reached the alley behind Greta's shop. As Murphy prepared to leave, he offered one final piece of advice that reflected his own experience as an immigrant who had learned to navigate hostile social environments. "When you see her," Murphy said, "don't waste time dancing around what you both know is true. Life's too uncertain out here to let fear of what other people think keep you from claiming what happiness you can find." Alone again at his homestead, Marcus spent the remaining hours before dawn preparing for what might be his final opportunity to see Greta safely. He cleaned his weapons, organized his supplies, and wrote a letter that explained his defensive preparations and tactical assessments. But mostly, he thought about the woman who had risked everything to warn him about danger, and what he might say to her if given the chance. The approach to Cedar Junction through Willow Creek required all of Marcus's cavalry training in stealth movement. The creek bed provided excellent concealment, but it also limited his mobility and escape routes if he was discovered. Every shadow could hide a sentry. Every sound could trigger an alarm that would bring Jeremy's men down on him. Before he could reach safety, he reached the alley behind Greta's shop just as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. The building was dark and quiet, but Marcus could see light seeping around the edges of the window coverings in Greta's upstairs living quarters. She was awake, probably sewing or reading, perhaps thinking about the same questions that had occupied his mind during the long night. Marcus's soft knock on the back door was answered immediately, as if Greta had been waiting for his arrival. She opened the door wearing a simple dress with her golden hair pinned back in a practical style, but her blue eyes held an intensity that spoke to sleepless hours spent wrestling with emotions and possibilities. "I hoped you would come," she said simply, stepping aside to let him enter the narrow hallway that led to her living quarters. The apartment above the dress shop was small but comfortable, furnished with pieces that reflected Greta's European background and her practical needs. As a working woman, a sewing basket sat beside a comfortable chair near the window, while books in both German and English lined shelves that also held the few personal mementos she had brought from Bavaria. "Murphy told me about the trouble you're facing," Marcus said as they sat at her small dining table. "The boycott, the broken window, the threats. You're risking everything to help me, and I'm not sure I understand why." Greta studied his face in the lamplight, noting the lines of fatigue and concern that spoke to the pressure he was under. "Don't you?" she asked quietly, the directness of her question cut through all the social barriers and practical objections that had kept them apart. Marcus found himself looking into her eyes and seeing not just courage and determination, but something deeper and more personal that made his heart race despite all the reasons why such feelings were dangerous. "I think I do," he admitted. "But thinking and saying it out loud are different things. And even saying it doesn't change the facts about what we're up against." Greta reached across the table and placed her hand on his, her touch warm and sure despite the trembling that revealed her nervousness. "I've been thinking about those facts," she said. "About what people will say, what they'll do, how they'll try to hurt us for caring about each other." "And?" Marcus asked, though he could see the answer in her expression. "And I've decided that I don't care," Greta said with quiet conviction. "I came to America to be free, to make my own choices about how I live and who I love. If I let their hatred control my decisions, then I'm not really free at all." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Marcus felt the weight of everything that separated them: race, social expectations, the violent opposition of men who would kill to prevent what they were contemplating. But he also felt the pull of genuine affection and respect that had grown between them through shared danger and mutual support. "You know what this means," Marcus said carefully. "If we acknowledge what's between us, if we act on it, there's no going back. They'll never accept it, never leave us in peace." "Then we'll fight," Greta replied with the same determination that had driven her to warn him about the first attack. "Together, whatever comes, we'll face it together." Marcus stood and moved to the window, looking out at the town that had become a battlefield over his right to exist as a free man. Adding the complication of an interracial relationship would escalate the conflict beyond anything they had faced so far, but it would also give him something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. "There's something else," Marcus said, turning back to face her. "Murphy thinks Cole's planning a major attack. More men, better organization, designed to finish what they started. If you're with me, you'll be a target too." "I'm already a target," Greta pointed out. "At least this way, I'll be fighting for something that matters to me personally, not just abstract principles of justice." The logic was undeniable, but it also meant accepting a level of danger that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. They were talking about building a life together while surrounded by people who would literally kill to prevent it. Marcus returned to the table and took both of Greta's hands in his, marveling at how right it felt despite all the reasons why. "It should have been impossible. If we're going to do this," he said, "we do it properly. Not hiding, not apologizing, not pretending it's something other than what it is." "What are you saying?" Greta asked, though her quickening pulse suggested she already knew. "I'm saying that if I'm going to die defending my right to be free, I want to die as your husband," Marcus replied. "Will you marry me, Greta Hoffman?" The proposal was both romantic and practical, heartfelt and strategic. Marriage would formalize their alliance and make their commitment public, forcing their enemies to confront not just a political alliance, but a genuine love story that challenged everything they believed about racial hierarchy. "Yes," Greta said without hesitation, "but we'll need to do it quickly, before they can organize to stop us." "Father O'Malley will perform the ceremony," Marcus said, "and we'll do it publicly, in the church, with witnesses. Let them see that love is stronger than their hatred." As dawn broke over Cedar Junction, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Marcus and Greta began planning not just their wedding, but their strategy for surviving the war that their marriage would certainly provoke. They were about to transform a conflict over land rights into a battle over the very meaning of freedom and equality in post-war America that the engagement of Buffalo Soldier Marcus Washington and German immigrant Greta Hoffman would soon become the catalyst for a confrontation that would determine not just their personal fate, but the character of an entire community. Their love story was about to become a legend, but first they would have to survive the hatred of those who could not accept that the heart recognizes no boundaries of race or nation. News of Marcus Washington's engagement to Greta Hoffman spread through Cedar Junction like wildfire, igniting reactions that ranged from shock, disbelief to murderous rage. Father O'Malley had barely finished posting the marriage banns on the church door when word reached every corner of the small frontier town, transforming what should have been a private celebration into a public declaration of war against the racial order that many residents considered sacred and immutable. The priest himself had wrestled with the decision to perform the ceremony. While his faith taught that all souls were equal before God, his practical experience in frontier communities had shown him the terrible consequences that could follow when religious principles collided with social prejudices. But after praying through the night and consulting with his own conscience, Father O'Malley had concluded that refusing to marry two people who genuinely loved each other would make him complicit in the very hatred that his ministry was supposed to combat. "The ceremony will be held this Sunday morning," Father O'Malley announced to Marcus and Greta as they met in the church sacristy to finalize the arrangements. "I've scheduled it for the regular service time, so anyone who wants to attend can do so, and anyone who wants to object will have to do it in the house of God, where they'll need to answer for their actions." The decision to hold the wedding during regular Sunday service was both courageous and strategic. It would force the entire community to confront the reality of the marriage, rather than allowing opponents to dismiss it as a secret ceremony conducted without proper witnesses. More importantly, it would place any violent opposition in the context of sacred space, where even the most hardened opponents might hesitate to shed blood. But the announcement also gave Jeremiah Cole and his followers 3 days to organize their response, and their reaction was swift and coordinated. Within hours of the marriage bans being posted, Confederate veterans began arriving in Cedar Junction from surrounding counties, drawn by word that their cause required immediate action to prevent what they saw as the ultimate abomination. Samuel Mitchell, his arm still in a sling from the wound Greta had inflicted during the Creek battle, served as Jeremiah's lieutenant in organizing the opposition response. Despite his injury, or perhaps because of it, Mitchell threw himself into the planning with the fervor of a man seeking both revenge and redemption. "We're not just talking about one Buffalo soldier and one German whore anymore," Mitchell declared to the gathering of nearly 30 armed men who had assembled in the back room of the Cattleman's Rest Saloon. "We're talking about the future of white civilization in this territory. If we let this happen, if we allow race mixing to be celebrated in a Christian church, then everything we fought for in the war becomes meaningless." The rhetoric was deliberately inflammatory, designed to transform a local conflict into a crusade that would justify any level of violence. Mitchell and his brother Daniel, who had recovered enough from his wound to ride, had spent the previous day visiting ranches and farms throughout the region, spreading word that Cedar Junction was facing an invasion of racial equality that threatened every white family in Kansas. Jeremiah Cole himself took a more sophisticated approach to building opposition. Rather than relying solely on racial hatred, he framed the issue in terms of law, order, and community standards that would appeal to respectable citizens who might be uncomfortable with openly violent rhetoric. "This isn't about personal feelings," Cole explained to a gathering of business owners and community leaders in the bank's conference room. "It's about maintaining the social stability that allows commerce and civilization to flourish. When people start ignoring the natural boundaries that God and nature have established, the result is chaos that destroys everything we've worked to build." The meeting included several prominent figures who had previously remained neutral in the conflict between Marcus and the Confederate veterans. Bank President Charles Patterson, whose wife had led the economic boycott against Greta, attended along with Territorial Land Commissioner Edgar Thompson and Judge William Blackwood, who had recently arrived from the county seat to review pending legal cases. "What exactly are you proposing?" Patterson asked, his banker's instincts making him cautious about commitments that might have unpredictable consequences. I'm proposing that this community speak with one voice about the standards we're willing to accept, Cole replied smoothly. The territorial marriage laws provide certain restrictions on who can marry whom. Perhaps it's time those laws were more rigorously enforced. Judge Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The territorial statutes don't explicitly prohibit interracial marriage, he pointed out. There are some counties where such unions are discouraged, but there's no clear legal basis for preventing this ceremony. Then perhaps we need to create that basis, Cole suggested. A community petition to the territorial legislature demanding clarification of marriage laws. A formal complaint about the priest who's enabling this violation of community standards. Economic pressure on businesses that support racial mixing. The strategy was more sophisticated than simple violence, though everyone in the room understood that physical force remained an option if legal and economic measures proved insufficient. Cole was offering respectable opponents a way to fight the marriage without directly participating in vigilante action. Meanwhile, Marcus and Greta were making their own preparations for what they knew would be the most dangerous day of their lives. The church wedding would place them in an exposed position where their enemies could attack with overwhelming force, but it would also force those enemies to reveal their true nature in front of the entire community. We'll need security, Marcus said as he and his allies met in Dr. Harrison's clinic to coordinate their defensive plans. People positioned both inside and outside the church, ready to respond if Cole's men try to disrupt the ceremony. Patrick Murphy had assembled the core group of supporters who were willing to fight if necessary. In addition to himself, Father O'Malley, and Dr. Harrison, the group included 4 other men. Thomas Anderson, a Swedish farmer whose own experience with ethnic prejudice had made him sympathetic to Marcus's situation. Robert Chun, a Chinese railroad worker who had settled in Cedar Junction after completing the transcontinental line. Miguel Santos, a Mexican vaquero who worked for one of the larger ranches. And surprisingly, Benjamin Henderson, whose merchant's pragmatism had evolved into genuine moral conviction. 8 men against 30 or more, Dr. Harrison observed grimly. Not exactly favorable odds. Numbers aren't everything, Marcus replied, his military training evident in his tactical assessment. We'll be fighting from defensive positions, with clear fields of fire and predetermined fallback routes. More importantly, we'll be fighting for something we believe in, while they're fighting to preserve something that's already dying. The week leading up to the wedding became a period of intensive preparation that resembled military mobilization more than typical matrimonial arrangements. Marcus moved into town, taking a room at Murphy's boarding house where he could coordinate security while remaining close to Greta. The decision to abandon his homestead temporarily was both practical and symbolic. He was bringing the fight to his enemies rather than waiting for them to attack him on ground of their choosing. Greta, meanwhile, faced the unique challenge of preparing for both a wedding and a war. She spent her days sewing her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation in cream-colored silk that would make a powerful statement about dignity and hope in the face of hatred. But she also spent her evenings cleaning weapons and learning to load ammunition under pressure, skills that might prove essential if the church ceremony became a battlefield. The transformation of their romance into a community-wide conflict attracted attention from beyond Cedar Junction's borders. A reporter from the Kansas City newspaper arrived to cover what he described as the most controversial wedding in territorial history, while territorial officials began paying closer attention to a situation that could affect Kansas's reputation as it prepared for full statehood. Most significantly, Captain William Hayes, Marcus's former commanding officer in the 10th Cavalry, arrived in town with unofficial orders to assess the situation and provide whatever support might be necessary to protect a decorated veteran's civil rights. Hayes brought with him 2 other Buffalo soldiers who were officially on leave, but clearly prepared to fight if circumstances required it. "The Army doesn't abandon its own," Has told Marcus as they met privately in Father O'Malley's rectory. "What you're doing here matters beyond just your personal situation. If we let Confederate veterans terrorize former Union soldiers with impunity, we might as well admit that we lost the war after all." The arrival of additional Buffalo soldiers changed the tactical balance significantly, but it also escalated the symbolic stakes of the conflict. What had begun as a local dispute over land rights had evolved into a test of whether the Union's victory in the Civil War would translate into genuine equality for the people who had fought to preserve it. As Sunday morning approached, Cedar Junction resembled a town under siege. Armed men moved through the streets with barely concealed weapons, while ordinary citizens barricaded themselves in their homes to avoid being caught in whatever violence might erupt. The church itself became the focal point of tensions that had been building not just for weeks, but for decades. Father O'Malley spent Saturday evening in prayer and preparation, knowing that the ceremony he was about to perform would either represent a triumph of love over hatred or become a funeral for principles that many Americans claim to hold sacred. The small frontier church had never hosted an event with such far-reaching implications, and the priest felt the weight of history as he prepared to challenge the forces that sought to keep America divided along racial lines. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Marcus Washington and Greta Hoffman, but the meaning of freedom and equality in post-war America. Their wedding day would prove whether love could indeed conquer hate, or whether the promises of the Constitution were just empty words when tested by the reality of human prejudice and violence. As the sun set on Saturday evening, both sides made their final preparations for a battle that would be fought not with armies and artillery, but with courage and conviction in the sacred space of a frontier church. The outcome would echo far beyond the borders of Cedar Junction, Kansas, and into the heart of America's ongoing struggle to define what equality actually meant in practice rather than principle. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear over Cedar Junction, with golden autumn sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Catholic Church's. Father O'Malley prepared for the most consequential ceremony of his ministry. The small frontier church had never held so many armed men, nor witnessed such a collision between love and hatred, hope and fear, the promise of America's future and the ghosts of its divided past. Marcus Washington stood at the altar in his dress blue cavalry uniform, every brass button polished to perfection, his bearing reflecting both the dignity of a decorated soldier and the nervous anticipation of a groom about to marry the woman he loved. Beside him stood Captain William Hayes and the 2 Buffalo soldiers who had ridden from Fort Leavenworth, their presence serving as both honor guard and tactical support should the ceremony be disrupted by violence. The church filled slowly as Cedar Junction's residents made their individual choices about witnessing what many considered either a historic moment of progress or a dangerous violation of natural order. Dr. Harrison sat in the front pew alongside Patrick Murphy and the the other allies who had committed to defending the ceremony with their lives if necessary. Behind them, scattered throughout the sanctuary, sat families who had decided that their Christian faith required them to support love over hatred, regardless of the social consequences. But the church also held those who had come to bear witness to what they hoped would be prevented. Mrs. Patterson and her social circle occupied an entire pew, their faces reflecting the grim satisfaction of people expecting to see their dire predictions confirmed. Edgar Thompson from the land office sat nearby, along with several other territorial officials whose presence suggested that the ceremony's legitimacy might face legal challenges even if it proceeded without physical violence. Most ominously, Jeremiah Cole and his core supporters had positioned themselves strategically throughout the sanctuary, their weapons concealed but readily accessible. Samuel and Daniel Mitchell flanked Cole in a pew near the center aisle, while other Confederate veterans were distributed to provide overlapping fields of fire if they decided to turn the sacred space into a battlefield. Outside the church, additional tensions simmered as nearly 50 armed men gathered in groups that reflected the community's fundamental divisions. Some were Cole's reinforcements from neighboring counties, men who had traveled considerable distances to prevent what they saw as an attack on white supremacy. Others were territorial law enforcement officers who had arrived to maintain order, but whose own sympathies were unclear. A few were simply curious observers, drawn by reports of the most controversial wedding in Kansas territorial history. The reporter from the Kansas City newspaper positioned himself where he could observe both the ceremony and any disruption that might occur, his pencil ready to record events that would be reported across the nation. The story of a Buffalo soldier marrying a German immigrant had already attracted attention far beyond the borders of Cedar Junction, and the outcome would send a message about whether America's promises of equality could survive the test of practical implementation. As the appointed hour approached, Father O'Malley took his position at the altar and opened his prayer book to the marriage ceremony that had joined countless couples in holy matrimony. But never before had those ancient words carried such weight, nor been spoken in circumstances where their very utterance represented an act of defiance against forces determined to prevent their completion. "Dearly beloved," Father O'Malley began, his Irish accent carrying clearly through the tense silence that filled the sanctuary, "we are gathered together here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation, to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The traditional opening words had barely been spoken when Jeremiah Cole rose from his pew, his pale blue eyes fixed on the priest with cold determination. "I object to these proceedings," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his will respected. Father O'Malley had expected this moment and prepared for it. "On what grounds do you object, Mr. Cole?" "On the grounds that this union violates the natural order established by God and nature," Cole replied, his words carefully chosen to appeal to religious sensibilities. "The mixing of races leads to the degradation of both, and no Christian ceremony should sanctify what the Lord has clearly separated." The objection created a moment of profound tension as every person in the church waited to see how Father O'Malley would respond. The priest's answer would determine not just whether the ceremony continued, but whether the forces of hatred or love would prevail in this test of American principles. "Mr. Cole," Father O'Malley said with quiet dignity, "I find no scriptural basis for your objection. The Bible teaches that God created all people in His image, and that love is the greatest commandment. If you have legal grounds for preventing this marriage, present them. If not, please allow this couple to exchange their vows in peace." Cole's face hardened as his religious argument was rejected, and he glanced meaningfully at his supporters, positioned throughout the sanctuary. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a signal that legal and moral persuasion had failed, and that more direct action might be necessary. But before Cole could escalate the confrontation, an unexpected voice spoke from the back of the church. "I have something to say about this matter." Every head turned to see Judge William Blackwood walking down the center aisle, his black robes and official bearing commanding attention even from Cole's armed supporters. The territorial judge had arrived unannounced, and his presence immediately changed the legal and political dynamics of the situation. "Your Honor," Cole said, his tone suggesting confidence that judicial authority would support his position, "I trust you're here to prevent this violation of territorial law and community standards." Judge Blackwood's expression was stern as he reached the front of the sanctuary, but his words surprised everyone who had assumed his sympathies. "I'm here to ensure that territorial law is properly observed, Mr. Cole, and territorial law recognizes the right of any two consenting adults to enter into marriage, regardless of their race or national origin." The judge's declaration sent a ripple of shock through Cole's supporters, who had counted on legal authority to legitimize their opposition. Blackwood continued, his voice carrying the weight of official judicial pronouncement. Furthermore, any attempt to disrupt this lawful ceremony through violence or intimidation will be prosecuted as assault, disturbing the peace, and conspiracy against civil rights. I suggest that anyone considering such action reconsider their position very carefully." Cole's pale eyes burned with frustrated rage as his carefully planned strategy collapsed around him. The combination of religious authority supporting the marriage and judicial authority protecting it left him with only one option: direct violence that would transform him from a defender of social order into an obvious criminal. For a long moment, the church hung in perfect silence as Cole weighed his options. His hand rested on the concealed pistol at his hip, and Marcus tensed for the gunfight that would almost certainly follow if Cole decided to reject legal authority and rely on force. Then, unexpectedly, another voice cut through the tension. "Jeremiah, that's enough." The speaker was Daniel Mitchell, whose wounded arm and pale complexion testified to the price already paid for their campaign against Marcus and Greta. The younger Mitchell brother had spent days wrestling with the consequences of their escalating violence, and the sight of armed men preparing to shed blood in a church had finally broken through his commitment to the cause. "This isn't what we came west to build," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "We fought in the war. We lost people we cared about. We came here to start over. But this isn't starting over. This is just bringing the same hatred to a new place." Samuel Mitchell stared at his brother in shock and betrayal. "Danny, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm tired of fighting other people's wars," Daniel replied. "Tired of hating people I don't even know for reasons that don't make sense anymore. These two people want to get married and build a life together. How does that hurt us?" The defection of one of Cole's key supporters created a crack in the opposition's unity that spread rapidly through their ranks. Other men began looking uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as they reconsidered their commitment to preventing a marriage between two people who clearly loved each other. Father O'Malley recognized the moment and seized it. "If there are no further legal objections," he said, looking directly at Judge Blackwood, who nodded his approval, "then let us proceed with this holy ceremony." The priest turned to Marcus and Greta, who had stood together throughout the confrontation with a courage that had impressed even some of their opponents. "Marcus Washington, do you take Greta Hoffman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Marcus replied, his voice strong and clear, carrying to every corner of the church. "Greta Hoffman, do you take Marcus Washington to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Greta answered, her German accent adding a musical quality to words that would echo through Cedar Junction's history. "Then by the power vested in me by God and the territory of Kansas," Father O'Malley declared, "I pronounce you husband and wife. Marcus, you may kiss your bride." The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed by a church full of people, whose reactions ranged from tears of joy to grudging acceptance to sullen defeat. It was a moment that transformed two individuals into a symbol of possibility, proving that love could indeed conquer the forces that sought to divide Americans along lines of race and prejudice. Jeremiah Cole stood slowly and walked toward the church door, his pale eyes promising that this defeat was temporary rather than final. But his followers were no longer unified behind him. Some followed their leader out of the sanctuary, while others remained seated, their commitment to hatred shaken by witnessing the power of love expressed in sacred space. As Marcus and Greta walked down the aisle as husband and wife, they passed through a congregation that represented America itself, divided, conflicted, but capable of progress when individuals had the courage to choose love over fear, justice over tradition, hope over despair. The wedding reception was held in Murphy's boarding house, where friends and supporters celebrated not just a marriage, but a victory for principles that many had thought impossible to defend successfully. Captain Hayes presented the couple with a letter from the War Department, officially commending Marcus for his service and guaranteeing federal protection for his civil rights. Judge Blackwood contributed a legal document establishing their marriage as valid throughout the territory, immune from future legal challenges. But the most meaningful gift came from Daniel Mitchell, who appeared at the reception carrying an envelope that contained something no one had expected: a signed statement withdrawing all legal challenges to Marcus's homestead claim, along with a formal apology for the violence that had been committed. "In the name of racial purity, I can't undo what we did," Mitchell said as he handed the document to Marcus. "But I can make sure it doesn't happen again. Your land is yours, free and clear, and anyone who tries to take it will have to go through me." 6 months later, Marcus and Greta Washington's homestead had become one of the most prosperous farms in the region, its success serving as proof that determination and hard work mattered more than the color of a person's skin. Their marriage had produced not just personal happiness, but a transformation in Cedar Junction's character, as other residents began to question prejudices they had once accepted without examination. Jeremiah Cole and his remaining followers had drifted away to other territories where their particular brand of hatred might find more fertile ground. Some of the Confederate veterans who had opposed the marriage remained in the area, but gradually accepted the reality that America was changing, whether they liked it or not. The story of the Buffalo Soldier who married the German immigrant became legend throughout Kansas and beyond, inspiring other couples to challenge racial barriers and proving that love truly could conquer hate when supported by courage, community, and an unwavering commitment to the principles that made America worth fighting for. Their love story had become America's story, imperfect, difficult, sometimes violent, but ultimately hopeful in its promise that all people could find freedom and happiness if they had the courage to claim it and the determination to defend it against those who would deny it to others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.